This really happened to me, and though it's painful to relive, I need to tell it the way it unfolded. It all started in my grandfather's living room, the smell of his old cigar smoke still clinging to the curtains, when I found the police folder lying open on the coffee table. His name was scrawled across the top in bold letters, like he was already guilty before anyone even heard him out. My blood froze as I realized the accusation they were trying to pin a murder on him. A man who'd never raised his voice at anyone, let alone killed someone. And the worst part, I knew exactly who had orchestrated it. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel. Tell us where you're from and what time it is. Right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. I guess to understand how I ended up staring at that folder, you need to know who my grandfather really was and why someone powerful enough wanted to see him buried under a crime he didn't commit. It began years earlier, long before the police ever came knocking at our door. I grew up in Philadelphia, tucked between the brick row houses where gossip spread faster than church bells on Sunday morning. My grandfather Samuel Price had lived on the same block in South Philly for over 60 years. Everyone knew him, everyone respected him, and honestly, most people owed him a favor at one point or another. He was the kind of man who helped fix your car without asking for payment, who'd sit on the stoop sipping black coffee while kids ran circles around him. He was a veteran, a retired machinist, and the backbone of our family. To me, he wasn't just Grandpa was living proof that goodness and integrity could survive in a world that often rewards cruelty, which is why the idea of him ever being linked to murder felt like an obscene joke, except it wasn't a joke at all. I first noticed something was off that summer. My grandfather, who'd always been meticulous about his routines, started looking over his shoulder when we walked to the corner. Deli head whisper, "Don't linger too long outside," or "Keep your head down." At first I thought maybe it was just age making him paranoid, but the fear in his eyes told a different story. One hot August evening, while we were having dinner, me, my mom, and Grandpa, I noticed the way his hands trembled as he buttered a piece of rye bread. I pressed him gently. "Grandpa, what's going on with you lately? You've been different." He hesitated, staring at the bread knife in his hand, as if it were a weapon pointed at him. Finally he said, "They're watching me," who I asked half, convinced he'd gone off into some old war memories. "The Rossi family," he whispered, his eyes flicking toward the window. "And if they have their way, they'll pin something ugly on me." Now the Rossi family wasn't just some neighborhood name you dropped lightly. They were one of those families that had their hands in everything from construction contracts to underground poker games. Everyone knew they had money, power, and connections that stretched into City Hall and beyond you. Didn't cross the Rossi family, because if you did, you ended up broke missing, or worse. At first, I didn't believe him. Why would the Rossi family target an 80-year-old veteran who spent most of his time tending to his tomato plants? But then a week later, the police knocked on his door. Two detectives came in with grim expressions. They asked questions that didn't make sense. Where had he been the night before? Did he know a man named Victor Rossi? Had he ever set foot inside an abandoned warehouse near the Delaware River? Grandpa kept shaking his head, confused, while I stood frozen by the kitchen counter. After they left, leaving behind the folder, I later found I pressed him harder. "What aren't you telling me?" Grandpa leaned back in his chair, the weight of the world on his shoulders. "Years ago, I worked at the naval shipyard with a man named Tony Rossi. He tried to rope me into some shady side business, smuggling kickbacks. You name it," I told him. "No," walked away. That didn't sit well with him. He said, "I'd regret crossing him." I could practically feel the heat of anger rising up in my chest. "So now they were trying to make you pay for something you didn't do. After all these years?" Grandpa nodded slowly. "They found their chance." It wasn't long before the chance revealed itself. Victor Rossi, the youngest son of the family, was found dead in that very warehouse the detectives mentioned. Shot twice in the chest. The Rossi family swore up and down that my grandfather had threatened Victor in public weeks before the murder. Suddenly witnesses popped up, claiming they saw Grandpa arguing with Victor near 9th Street. None of it made sense, but the story was tight enough to make him look like a bitter old man with a grudge. The humiliation came swiftly. Neighbors who once smiled and waved suddenly avoided eye contact. The corner deli owner, who used to keep a pack of gum aside, just for Grandpa, wouldn't even make small talk. I remember the sting when one of my high school friends muttered, "Isn't your grandpa that murderer guy?" as if it were common knowledge. But the cruelest blow came when I saw him in handcuffs. They arrested him at dawn one morning, right in front of our house. Red and blue lights lit up the entire block, and the Rossi family stood across the street, smirking as though they had already won. I'll never forget the look on my grandfather's face. Not fear, not anger, but shame, as if he'd failed us. That was the moment I knew I couldn't sit back. If they thought they could bury him under their lies, they had another thing coming. I started digging. First, I retraced Grandpa's steps the night of the murder. He'd been home watching an old John Wayne movie when the shots rang out across the city. My mom vouched for him, but the police dismissed her testimony as biased. I knew I needed something stronger, something they couldn't ignore. So, I went to the warehouse myself. It was a hollowed-out shell of a building, graffiti-covered and stinking of mold. Yellow police tape still clung to the rusted doors. Inside, broken glass, crunched. Under my sneakers, as I searched for anything that might prove my grandfather wasn't there. That's when I noticed it, a half-burned cigarette butt tucked behind a stack of rotting wooden pallets. Grandpa didn't smoke. But I knew someone who did. Tony Rossi, the patriarch of the family, was famous for his imported Italian cigarettes, thick, pungent things he smoked like a chimney. The police report made no mention of cigarette evidence. Either they overlooked it, or someone made sure it never saw the light of day. I pocketed it, my heart hammering, and walked out into the sunlight, with the beginnings of a plan forming in my head. But plans mean nothing when you're going up against a family that practically owned half the city. And the more I pulled at the threads, the more I realized just how dangerous this game was about to get. Because a week later, I found a threatening note shoved under our front door. In sloppy handwriting it read, "Stop digging, or you'll join him in a coffin." I knew then that I wasn't just fighting for my grandfather's freedom. I was fighting for my own life, and I wasn't backing down. The days after that note arrived were some of the longest of my life. I barely slept every creak of the house, making me jolt upright. My mom tried to keep a strong face for Grandpa, but I could see the fear behind her eyes. She worked nights as a nurse at Jefferson Hospital, and every time she left, I worried she wouldn't come back. The Rossi family didn't need to get their own hands dirty. They had people who do their bidding without question. Grandpa, meanwhile, grew quieter. He refused to talk about the note, brushing it off as empty threats. But I could tell he was shaken. His strong frame seemed smaller, somehow hunched under a weight he'd carried for decades. I'd catch him staring at the wall, whispering names from the past men. He'd worked with men who were long gone now. He was piecing something together in his head, but he wouldn't share it with me. So I took it on myself to keep digging. I started with the people who claimed they'd seen Grandpa arguing with Victor Rossi. The police report listed 3 witnesses: a bartender, a taxi driver, and some woman who lived in an apartment near 9th Street. I knew the cops hadn't just found these people. Someone had lined them up. First stop was O'Malley's Bar, a dingy place near the Italian market. The bartender, a wiry guy with a scruffy beard, sized me up when I walked in. "You're Price's grandson, aren't you?" He muttered, polishing a glass. "Yeah," I said, my throat dry. "I heard you told the cops. My grandfather fought with Victor Rossi here." He smirked the kind of smirk that made my fists clench. That's what I saw. Except I knew he was lying. My grandfather never set foot in that bar. He hated the smell of beer. Said it reminded him of the shipyard drunks. So I leaned in close. "Funny, because the night you claim that happened, Grandpa was home with me and my mom, watching the searchers. You sure you want to stick with your story?" The bartender's eyes flickered just for a second. Then he leaned back. "Look, kid, I don't know what to tell you. That's what I told the cops, and that's what he keeps saying. Now, unless you're here to buy a drink, get lost." I left my stomach churning. Someone had clearly paid him off or scared him into lying. The taxi driver was no better. When I tracked him down at the cab depot near Broad Street, he swore up and down he'd given Grandpa a ride close to the warehouse. But when I pressed him for details, what clothes Grandpa wore, what time it was, got cagey. His story fell apart under basic questions. By the time I reached the woman's apartment, I half expected another dead end, but this one was different. She was in her 50s with tired eyes and an oxygen tank hissing softly beside her couch. When I introduced myself, she looked at me with a mix of pity and regret. I didn't want to testify. She said, her voice raspy. But they said if I didn't, I'd lose my housing. They've got people everywhere. Landlords, inspectors. You don't cross them. Her confession hit me like a gut punch. Proof that the witnesses were coerced, but not the kind of proof the cops would accept. Still, it gave me something. A sliver of hope I needed more, so I reached out to an old friend, Marcus, a guy I'd gone to high school with, had taken a different path than me, one that led him deep into Philly's underground scene. If anyone could sniff out Rossi connections, it was him. We met at Pat's King of Steaks around midnight, the neon lights buzzing overhead as drunks stumbled out of South Street bars. Marcus leaned against the counter, wolfing down a cheesesteak, while I spilled everything. Grandpa. The murder? The frame-up? When I finished, he wiped his mouth and said, "You're in deep, man. The Rossis don't play fair. I don't care," I shot back. "They want to bury my grandfather for something he didn't do. I need leverage dirt. Anything." Marcus studied me for a long moment before nodding. "I might know someone, guy named Reggie, used to run with the Rossis, but fell out after a deal, went bad. Lives over in Kensington. Now, if anyone's got stories that could blow holes in their case, it's him." Kensington was no place you visited lightly, especially at night, but I didn't hesitate. The next evening I drove out there, the streets lined with abandoned factories and boarded-up row houses. I found Reggie in a halfway house, chain-smoking on the stoop. His eyes darted nervously when I mentioned Victor Rossi's name. "You Price's grandson?" he asked. "Yeah." He let out a bitter laugh. "Figures they'd pin it on him. He's clean, always has been. That's why Tony hated him. Couldn't buy him, couldn't scare him. Price was too proud. I leaned in. So, who killed Victor?" Reggie stubbed out his cigarette, glancing around before lowering his voice. "Victor was sloppy. Got into some heat with a Jersey crew over a gambling debt. Tony couldn't let his son look weak, so he had Victor taken out. Family, honor, and all that. Now they're spinning it on your granddad, 'cause he's an easy target." My chest tightened. "You're saying Victor's own father had him killed?" Reggie nodded grimly. "But you didn't hear it from me. It was explosive, but it was just words. No evidence. No jury would believe a disgraced ex-associate with a drug record over the Rossi family polished lies. Still, it gave me a clearer picture. The Rossis weren't just framing Grandpa to settle an old score. They were covering up a crime within their own bloodline. The problem was, they still held all the cards. Grandpa sat in jail awaiting trial, his health deteriorating by the day, while the Rossis strutted around like kings. I visited him at the detention center one rainy afternoon. Seeing him in that orange jumpsuit behind glass broke something in me. His hands trembled as he picked up the phone. "They've won," he whispered. "You can't fight them. Not these people." "Yes, I can." I insisted, my voice shaking. "You didn't raise me to back down. You raised me to stand up for what's right." He looked at me with tired eyes. "Then be careful. They'll come after you next." His warning came true faster than I expected. That night as I walked home from the train station, a black SUV slowed beside me. The window rolled down, and a voice I recognized instantly. "Tony Ross," is called out. "Kid, stop playing detective, go home. Or we'll put you in the ground next to Victor." The SUV roared off, leaving me trembling on the sidewalk soaked by the rain. It was clear now. I wasn't just up against lies, I was up against a machine built on fear, money, and blood. And if I wanted to save my grandfather, I'd have to dismantle it piece by piece. What I didn't know then was just how far they were willing to go. To silence me and how deep it'd have to sink into their world to bring them down. The trial date loomed like a storm cloud over our family, and with every passing day, the Rossi family flaunted their power more openly. They were everywhere, front row at church on Sundays, their names plastered on donation plaques at hospitals and schools, Tony Rossi shaking hands with councilmen outside City Hall. It was as if they were reminding the city, we own this place. Meanwhile, my grandfather rotted in a cell. His reputation shredded his name, spit out like poison in the neighborhood he'd once held together with quiet acts of kindness. I couldn't walk down 9th Street without overhearing whispers. "That's the murderer's grandson." They say the old man snapped. The shame burned, but beneath it boiled something hotter. Rage. Still, rage doesn't stand up in a courtroom. Evidence does. And the Rossis had stacked it all against him, the prosecutor. A slick-haired man named Daniel Cross seemed more like a politician than a lawyer. He spoke with confidence at every press conference, tossing out phrases like airtight case and credible witnesses. I knew damn well he was in the Rossi's pocket. He practically glowed when Tony Rossi stood behind him for photo ops. And then there was the judge, Judge Harold Lindell, an old friend of Tony's. I'd seen the two of them together at a fundraiser years ago. When my mom dragged me along, I remembered the way Tony clapped Lindell on the back, like they were frat brothers sharing a private joke. Now, Lindell was the one, presiding over my grandfather's trial. Everything screamed fixed. I tried to rally the family, but it was hard. My mom was stretched thin, working double shifts just to keep food on the table. My Uncle David, Grandpa's eldest son, refused to get involved. "You don't fight the Rossies," he told me flatly over the phone. "You survive them. Let Dad take the plea deal. Maybe hell, live out what's left of his life in prison." A plea deal, as if Grandpa would admit to something he hadn't done. The suggestion made me sick. I doubled down. Marcus helped me dig through city records, property deeds, anything that tied the Rossies to that warehouse where Victor had been found. We discovered the building wasn't just abandoned. It was owned by a shell company tied back to Rossi Construction. They tried to cover their tracks, but Marcus knew where to look. It was a start, but it wasn't enough. The trial began in late October inside the grand marble walls of the Criminal Justice Center on Filbert Street. I remember sitting in the gallery, the stale smell of old wood and floor polish heavy in the air. Grandpa shuffled in, wearing his prison jumpsuit, looking smaller than ever. The sight nearly broke me. The prosecution wasted no time painting him as a bitter old man, consumed by resentment, who finally snapped and took revenge on the Rossi family. Witness after witness paraded onto the stand, each one telling a rehearsed story about arguments they claimed to have overheard, threats they said Grandpa had made. And every time I looked at the jury, I saw the doubt creeping in. They believed it. The Rossis had orchestrated the perfect theater, and my grandfather was their villain. I tried to get our defense attorney, a court-appointed man named Klein, to push harder, but he seemed outmatched. He questioned the witnesses, sure, but without evidence to disprove them. It felt like throwing pebbles at a brick wall. The worst blow came when the prosecution unveiled a supposed piece of forensic evidence, a pair of work gloves stained with gunpowder, residue allegedly found in Grandpa's garage. I knew they weren't his. She hadn't worked with machinery in years, and those gloves looked brand new. But the jury didn't know that. They just saw gunpowder and garage and connected the dots the prosecutor wanted them to. It felt hopeless. But then, a lifeline. Marcus showed up one night with a flash drive, his eyes wild with adrenaline. I hacked into one of the Rossi contractor's email servers. He said, "Check this out." On the drive were exchanges between Rossi construction executives about cleaning up the warehouse after Victor's death. One email even mentioned removing cigarette butts plural, which meant the one it found hadn't been the only one. This was proof the crime scene had been tampered with. If we could get it admitted, it might shred the prosecution's case, but sneaking hacked emails into court, that was a different beast. If the judge dismissed them, and I knew Lindell would try, then we'd be back at square one. I decided to gamble. The next day, I slipped the emails to Klein. House looked nervous, just holding them, muttering about inadmissible evidence and chain of custody. But when he saw the line about cigarette butts, even he couldn't hide his excitement. "Well, try," he whispered, and try he did. In the middle of cross-examining one of the detectives, Klein dropped the bomb, suggesting that the warehouse crime scene had been altered under Rossi orders. The prosecutor objected immediately, the judge sustained, but the seed was planted. The jury leaned forward. They wanted to know more. That night, as I left the courthouse, two men followed me out of the parking garage. I recognized them. Rossi muscle, one shoved me against a wall, pressing a hand to my chest. "Last warning," Kitty hissed. "Drop it! You're messing with things you don't understand." I stared him down, heart hammering. I understand enough, and I'm not stopping. They left me bruised and shaken but alive. For now. The next morning, as I sat outside the courthouse, I saw Tony Rossi himself pull up in a sleek black car. He stepped out in a tailored suit, smiling, shaking hands with reporters. The cameras loved him. The jurors saw him as a grieving father, a pillar of the community. He was untouchable. Watching him, I realized just how impossible this fight was. He had the police, the prosecutor, the judge, half the damn city in his pocket. But I also realized something else. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. Not much, but enough, because he knew the truth was clawing its way to the surface. And if I kept digging, if I kept pushing, I could drag him down with it. And God help me. I was willing to risk everything to see that happen. The day I saw Tony Rossi outside the courthouse, shaking hands like a damn politician, something inside me snapped. Up until that moment, I'd been playing defense, reacting to their lies, their threats, their staged witnesses. But standing there watching reporters fawn over the man who had orchestrated my grandfather's destruction, I made a decision. I wasn't just going to prove my grandfather's innocence. I was going to tear Tony Rossi down brick by brick until nothing remained of his empire. The resolve hardened in my chest like steel. I spent the next week mapping out everything I knew about the Rossis, their businesses, their allies, their routines. Marcus helped me build a wall of corkboard in his apartment, string and push pins connecting names and locations. It looked like something out of a crime thriller, except this wasn't a movie. It was my life, and my grandfather's step one was evidence. The cigarette butt I'd pocketed at the warehouse still sat in a plastic bag in my desk drawer. But without DNA, it was just a piece of trash. So I called in a favor, my old chemistry professor at Temple University. Dr. Sanders owed me for tutoring his nephew in high school. I showed him the cigarette, explaining it was for a research project. He didn't ask questions, just agreed to run a test. A week later, the results came in. The DNA on the cigarette butt matched Tony Rossi. I stared at the report, my hands trembling. It was the smoking. Gun literally, proof that Tony himself had been at the warehouse the night of Victor's murder. Proof he had lied under oath when he claimed he was at home with his wife. But here was the problem. Judge Lindell would never allow it into evidence. If I gave this to Klein, the prosecutor would object. The judge would rule it inadmissible, and the jury would never hear it. The system was rigged, so I decided to play outside the system. Marcus and I leaked the DNA report anonymously to a local journalist named Karen Mitchell. She was known for her investigative pieces on Philly corruption, and she hated the Rossi family with a passion. When she saw what we had, her eyes lit up like fireworks. "This could topple them," she whispered, "if I can corroborate it." Within days, whispers began to spread in the press. Rumors that the Rossi patriarch hadn't been so innocent, that maybe the grieving father had secrets of his own. Tony responded with fury, calling it a smear campaign and parading his wife and surviving children in front of cameras like props. But the damage was done. The jury heard those whispers too. Meanwhile, I wasn't done digging Reggie. The ex-associate in Kensington had mentioned Victor's gambling debts. If I could find proof of that, it would establish motive. I traced Victor's bank records through a contact. Marcus knew at PNC. Buried in the statements were massive cash withdrawals, always right before meetings with a Jersey crew known for running illegal poker games. Then I found a text message Victor had sent to a cousin weeks before his death. "If my old man doesn't bail me out, they'll kill me." My blood ran cold. It confirmed what Reggie had told me. Victor's death wasn't a random hit. It was orchestrated. I printed the text, the bank statements, and the DNA report, and I stared at them spread across my desk. It was enough to destroy Tony Rossi, but getting it into the courtroom was the challenge, so I thought bigger. If the judge was in Rossi's pocket, I had to go over his head. Federal, the FB, I had been sniffing around Philly mob families for decades. If I handed them this package, they'd have no choice but to investigate. But before I could make that move, the Rossi struck first. Late one night, I came home to find our front door ajar. My heart dropped as I pushed it open. Inside, the place was ransacked, drawers pulled out, furniture overturned. On the wall, scrawled in red spray paint, were 3 words: "Your next kid." I staggered back, bile rising in my throat. My mom screamed when she saw it. Grandpa, locked away, couldn't protect us. It was all on me now. The next day, I marched into the FBI field office on Arch Street, clutching the folder of evidence. I demanded to see someone. Anyone. After hours of waiting, 2 agents finally sat me down. Their names were Agent Collins and Agent Rivera. They listened patiently as I laid everything out. The frame-up, the coerced witnesses, the DNA, the bank records. When I finished, Collins leaned back, arms crossed. "You realize what you're accusing here," he said slowly. "Tony Rossi killing his own son, framing your grandfather, and bribing half the justice system." "Yes," I snapped, "and I have proof." Rivera flipped through the folder, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded. "Well, look into it. But you need to understand, these cases take time, months, sometimes years." "We don't have years," I shouted. "My grandfather's trial is happening now." They exchanged a look. Collins sighed. "We can't intervene in an ongoing state trial without cause. But if your evidence checks out, well, open a file. That's the best we can promise." I left the building seething. They were interested but not enough, not fast enough, which meant the fight still fell to me. The trial reached its climax in early November. The prosecutor delivered a closing argument dripping with venom, painting Grandpa as a monster who'd harbored hatred for decades. Klain tried his best, waving the inconsistencies hinting at corruption. But it wasn't enough. The judge's gavel came down his instructions to the jury, sharp and biased. As the jury filed out to deliberate, I felt my knees buckle. This was it. Everything we'd fought for, every risk we'd take, and it might not matter. Hours ticked by. The jurors finally returned, their faces grim. The foreman stood. "We find the defendant." I held my breath, guilty of second-degree murder. The words rang in my ears like a gunshot. My mother sobbed beside me. Grandpa's shoulders slumped, his eyes hollow. The Rossi family smirked in the gallery, victory gleaming in their eyes. But as the gavel struck and chaos erupted, I felt something else stirring inside me. Not despair, not defeat, resolve. Because this wasn't the end, not by a long shot. They thought they'd won, but they didn't realize they just lit a fuse inside me, and I was going to burn their empire to the ground. The night the guilty verdict fell, I didn't sleep. I sat on the floor of my room, the evidence folder spread around me, pages curling under the sweat of my palms. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my grandfather in shackles, head bowed, as if he'd already resigned himself to dying behind bars. The sound of the gavel echoed in my skull like a gunshot. But if the Rossi family thought that verdict meant the end of me, they didn't understand who they were dealing with. This wasn't over. I started with the press. Karen Mitchell had already published whispers about Rossi. Corruption, but whispers weren't enough. I called her at 3 a.m, my voice hoarse. "I've got the full story." I said DNA, bank records, texts, everything. But I wanted to hit front page, not some buried column. When she saw the package, her jaw dropped. "This isn't rumor anymore," she said. "This is dynamite." She promised to go to print within days. At the same time, I turned my attention to the witnesses. The bartender, the cab driver, the woman in the apartment. I knew at least one of them had been coerced, and if I could get her to go on record, the whole facade could collapse. I went back to the woman with the oxygen tank. Her name was Evelyn. She opened the door cautiously, her eyes darting to the street like someone might be watching. "I can't," she whispered before I even spoke. "They'll kill me. They're already killing my grandfather," I pleaded. "Evelyn, you're the only one who can undo this." Tears welled in her eyes. She looked at the floor for a long time before nodding. "If I talk, it has to be on camera, live. So they can't bury it." Karen Mitchell set it up. A filmed interview in Evelyn's apartment. On tape, she admitted the truth that Rossi enforcers had threatened to evict her if she didn't testify against my grandfather. She described the night they came, the cold steel of a knife pressed to her arm, the fear that haunted her every day since. When the story aired, Philadelphia shook. Suddenly, the airtight case against Samuel Price didn't look so airtight anymore. The DA's office scrambled to defend itself, while Rossi lawyers went into overdrive, dismissing Evelyn as unstable and manipulated. But the public smelled blood. And I wasn't finished. Marcus dug deeper into Rossi finances, and what he found was gold offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, wire transfers from shell companies to city officials, payments to Judge Lindell himself. We printed everything and mailed copies to every newsroom in the city. Within a week, the FBI came, knocking again. Not to brush me off this time, but to ask for everything we had. Agent Rivera met me in a quiet diner near Rittenhouse Square. She slid into the booth, ordered black coffee, and leaned across the table. "You weren't bluffing," she said, tapping the folder. "This is big, too big to ignore. We're opening a racketeering investigation." Hope flickered in my chest. Finally, the walls were cracking, but the Rossis weren't about to roll over. 2 nights later, as I walked to Marcus's apartment, a car screeched onto the sidewalk. A masked man jumped out swinging a baseball bat. I barely ducked as it whistled past my skull. He caught me in the ribs, sending me sprawling, gasping for air. Before he could swing again, a neighbor's porch, light snapped on. The man bolted tires, squealing as the car vanished into the night. I lay on the pavement, pain burning through my chest. But all I could think was, they're scared. And if they were scared, it meant I was winning. The next escalation came in court. Klein filed a motion for appeal, armed with Evelyn's testimony and the leaked financials. The judge tried to stonewall, but the publicity was too loud to ignore. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps, cameras flashing, The Rossies couldn't silence everyone anymore. During one hearing, as Klein presented the new evidence, I locked eyes with Tony Rossi across the gallery. He was sweating. For the first time, the smug mask cracked. He mouthed something at me, lips curling into a snarl. "You'll regret this," but I didn't regret it. Not one bit, because every move I made tightened the noose around his empire. Karen published another bombshell expose, this one tying Rossi Construction to multiple unsolved murders stretching back decades. City contracts started to evaporate. Politicians distanced themselves. Even some of Tony's allies began to whisper about cutting ties. The man who once seemed untouchable now looked cornered, and yet the more desperate he became, the more dangerous he grew. One night Marcus called me in a panic. "They came after me," he gasped. "Two guys jumped me outside the bar. Said if I don't back off next time, they'll put me in the ground." I raced to his apartment and found him bloodied but alive. As I patched him up, guilt tore at me. I dragged him into this war. But Marcus just grinned through split lips. "We're close, man, real close. Don't stop now." I promised I wouldn't, because now it wasn't just about my grandfather. It was about every person the Rossies had crushed under their boots for decades. Every family they'd terrorized, every business they'd bled dry. This was bigger than us, and I was going to finish it. The question was how far I'd have to go, and how much of myself I'd lose in the process. The war had begun in full, and there was no going back. The Rossies had turned Philadelphia into their kingdom for decades, and I was the one dragging their sins into the sunlight. Every move I made brought more heat, more danger, but also more cracks in their empire. It was like watching a dam splinter under pressure. You could hear the groan of it, feel the tremor just before it burst. The FBI moved cautiously, building their racketeering case brick by brick. But I didn't have the luxury of patience. My grandfather's appeal was pending, his health slipping with every day in prison. He needed this war to be over now. So I went after the Rossies where it hurt most. Their reputation, Karen Mitchell's exposés, had set the city buzzing. But I pushed her for more. "We need faces, not just numbers." I told her, "People who can look into the camera and say, 'The Rossies ruined my life.' We started digging for survivors. Families who'd lost businesses after refusing to pay protection. Money shop owners who'd been forced into bankruptcy when Rossi thugs trashed their stores. Even a retired cop who admitted off-record that Rossi bribes had kept investigations buried. One by one, people came forward, terrified, yes, but also hungry for justice. We filmed their testimonies raw and unfiltered. When Karen aired the montage on the evening news, it landed like a bomb. "This is Philadelphia," her voiceover said. "And these are the voices silenced for too long." The Rossies tried damage control, lawyers calling it a smear campaign, politicians pleading ignorance, but the tide was turning. For the first time in decades, the city wasn't afraid of them. Meanwhile, Marcus and I dug deeper into their finances. We hacked into offshore transfers, shell corporations, bribery trails. The more we uncovered, the more it looked like a house of cards held together by intimidation. And then we found the smoking ledger. Hidden inside a scanned file from Rossi Construction servers was a set of books marked confidential. It listed payouts to judges, prosecutors, union leaders' names, and numbers that tied half the city to Rossi money. And right there in black and white was Judge Harold Lindell's name, $250,000 over 3 years. That was it. Proof the trial had been rigged from the start. I wanted to scream it from the rooftops, but Marcus stopped me. "Not yet," he warned. "Play it smart. Drop it too soon. They'll bury it. We need timing." So we waited. During the next appeal, hearing Klein argued passionately, armed with Evelyn's testimony and Karen's exposés. The Judge Lindell himself tried to cut him off, dismissed the evidence, but Klein pushed harder. And then, with the courtroom tense and silent, I stood. Against every rule against Klein's, panicked whispers. I walked forward holding the ledger. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady, despite my racing heart. "I have evidence that this court has been compromised. Evidence that you have been compromised." Gasps rippled through the room. Lindell's face went pale, his gavel trembling in his hand. The prosecutor shouted for order. Klein begged me to sit down, but it was too late. I read aloud the entry. Payment to Lindell, $50,000, dated March 14th. The jury, the reporters in the gallery, everyone heard it. Lindell recessed the court immediately, his face ashen, But the damage was done. The story spread like wildfire. Judge accused of bribe, ledger ties, Rossi family to courts. By that night, the FBI had raided Lindell's home. The dam was breaking. Tony Rossi responded like a cornered animal. His empire was collapsing, his allies vanishing, but he still had muscle. One evening as I walked my mom home from work, 2 black sedans boxed us in. Men piled out faces, hard hands, and jackets where guns surely waited. Tony himself stepped forward. No cameras, no reporters. Just the raw menace of a man who'd built a dynasty on fear. "You think you've won," he growled. "You're a kid playing with matches in a powder room. You don't know the fire you've lit." I forced myself to meet his eyes, though every instinct screamed to run. "You killed your own son," I said quietly. "And you tried to bury my grandfather for it. The whole city's going to know. The FBI's already on you. You're finished." For the first time, I saw real fear flash across his face. He masked it quickly, snarling, "You're dead." He motioned for his men. But just then, headlights cut through the street. FBI SUVs screeched and agents pouring out guns, drawn, "FBI, drop your weapons." Tony froze his men, lowering their hands reluctantly. Rivera stepped forward, badge gleaming. "Anthony Rossi, you're under arrest for racketeering, bribery, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit murder." The sight of Tony Rossi in handcuffs shoved into the back of a black SUV was one I would never forget. But it wasn't over yet. The trial of the century was about to begin, not against my grandfather, but against the man who had tried to destroy him. And this time, the city was watching. The war wasn't won, but the battlefield had shifted. And for the first time in months, I felt hope surge in my chest. The day Tony Rossi was hauled away in handcuffs, Philadelphia felt different. For the first time in decades, the city wasn't under his shadow. People who once whispered his name with fear now spat it with disgust. His empire was crumbling his allies, scattering like roaches when the lights come on. But my grandfather was still behind bars, convicted of a murder he hadn't committed, and until his name was cleared, there would be no victory. The FBI's case against Tony exploded into the headlines: racketeering, money laundering, obstruction, conspiracy. Karen Mitchell's articles became a drumbeat of truth that couldn't be silenced. Every day brought a new revelation: a union leader confessing to taking bribes, a cop admitting he'd buried evidence, a contractor flipping to save himself, and then the bombshell. The FBI released wiretap transcripts, conversations between Tony and his lieutenants cold and calculated. In one, Tony's voice was clear as day: "Victor's a liability. If we don't handle it, the Jersey crew will. Better it comes from us than from them." The words hit me like ice water. Proof that Tony had ordered his own sons. Death. Proof that my grandfather had been nothing but a scapegoat. The next morning, Klein filed a motion for immediate exoneration. The evidence was overwhelming. Within days, a judge, not Lindell, who now faced charges of his own, vacated the conviction. I'll never forget the moment Grandpa walked out of prison. His steps were slow, his shoulders stooped, but his eyes burned with life again. I hugged him so tightly I thought I'd break him. "You did it," he whispered into my ear. "You saved me," but I shook my head. "No, Grandpa, we did it. You taught me never to bow to men like them. I just followed your lesson." The Rossi trial was a circus. Every channel covered it. Every paper ran, front-page spreads. Tony sat in court, his once proud frame sagging as witness after witness testified to his crimes. The financial ledgers, the offshore accounts, the wiretaps, it all came crashing down on him. The defense tried to paint him as a grieving father, framed by overzealous prosecutors. But the jury didn't buy it. Not after hearing him order his son's execution on tape. When the verdict came, guilty on all counts, the city erupted. People cheered in the streets. Strangers shook my hand, clapped me on the back. "You brought him down," they said. But I didn't feel triumphant, not exactly, because I'd seen the cost. Marcus still walked with a limp from the beating he took. Evelyn, the woman who testified, lived in constant fear, her apartment windows now barred. My mother never slept a full night anymore, every creak of the house waking her in panic. And me, I wasn't the same kid who'd once believed the world was fair. I'd seen how deep corruption ran, how fragile justice really was. Still, when Tony Rossi was sentenced to life without parole, I felt a weight lift. The man who had ruled Philadelphia through fear would die in a cage the same way he'd tried to condemn my grandfather. As for Grandpa, he never fully recovered from the ordeal. Prison had taken years off his life. But every morning, he'd sit on the stoop again, sipping his black coffee, nodding to neighbors who now looked at him with shame in their eyes for ever doubting him. One evening, I asked him if he was angry for the years stolen, for the humiliation. He shook his head slowly. "Anger eats a man alive," he said. "But seeing the truth win, that's enough." He leaned closer, his voice low. "Just remember, kid, evil never dies. Easy men like Rossi, there'll always be more of them. And when they come, you've got to be ready." His words stayed with me, because even as Tony rotted in prison, I knew my grandfather was right. There would always be another Rossi, another man in a suit, smiling for cameras while pulling strings in the dark. But they'd also know something else, that if they tried to destroy my family again, I'd be waiting, and this time I wouldn't hesitate. That was the promise I made the night the Rossi Empire fell, and it's a promise I'll keep until the day I die. The end.